observations come at the end. I'm not sure. In mentioning the bookmark, I remember being introduced by the late Senator Paul Simon of Illinois many, many years ago. And he was holding up the latest book I'd written. He said, "Lester's written a sort of book that once you put it down, you can't pick it up again." Some of you may have read a couple of months ago the obituary of Liz Carpenter. Liz Carpenter was played many roles in the Johnson White House. I think she was Lady Bird Johnson's social secretary at one point. She was press secretary for the president himself, wrote some of his better speeches, a very talented writer and speaker. After the White House years, she wrote a book called Ruffles and Flourishes and was on book tour promoting it. And one night in a hotel lobby in Atlanta, Georgia, by chance, she ran into her former White House colleague, Arthur Schlesinger. And Arthur said, "Gee, Liz, that was a great book of yours. I really enjoyed it. Who wrote it for you?" She said, "Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, Arthur. Who read it to you?" I'd like to introduce two of my colleagues who are here this morning. Janet Larson, our Director of Research. Janet, where are you? Janet Larson. And Lauren Kubiak, who has just graduated from Stanford a few days ago and is interning with us this summer. Lauren? When we study the archaeological sites of early civilizations to try to figure out why they declined and collapsed, more often than not, it was food shortages that brought them down. For the Sumerians, the problem was rising salt levels in the soil. The Sumerians, as you know, were probably the first civilization, and the key to their success was an irrigation system they built on the Euphrates River. Barrages, we would call them dams today, backing up the water, and then a system of canals to gravity feed the water onto the land. Very fertile land, high yields, producing a food surplus so that some people could leave the land. And they created the first cities, first written language, the wheel, a whole series of breakthroughs came in that civilization. But there was a flaw in their irrigation system, which is that, as you know, irrigation water diverted on the land. Some of it evaporates, some of it's used by the plants, some of it percolates downward. And what they didn't know is that there was not a natural underground drainage system. So over civilization was flourishing, the water table was rising. And it got close to the surface, and then the deep-rooted crops didn't do as well. And then it got within inches of the surface, and the water started evaporating through into the atmosphere. But the salt, of course, does not evaporate, so the salt levels were accumulating. And their wheat yields began to go down. So then they shifted to barley, which is more salt tolerant. But eventually the barley yields also went down, and as they went down, so did the civilization. For the Mayans, the most advanced civilization in the Western Hemisphere, prior to European arrival, it was deforestation, soil erosion, and quite possibly came together and led to the decline and collapse of that civilization. And we can go down the list. I have long rejected the idea that food shortages could be the weak link in our modern civilization. But I now think not only that food could be the weak link, but it probably is the weak link. And I'd like to talk about why that may be the case. We look first at the demand side. We now have three sources of growing demand for grain. One, of course, is population growth. That's not new. That's been around since agriculture began. What is new is the scale. 80 million people a year. That means that there will be 216,000 people at the dinner table tonight who were not there last night. And tomorrow night there'll be another 216,000. And that daily addition of 216,000 people is beginning to challenge the world's economies. The second source of additional demand is rising affluence. There are 2 or 3 billion people in the world today who are moving up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive meat, milk, and eggs. The difference between someone living in the United States and someone living in India is a difference between 800 kilograms of grain consumption per person per year and 200 kilograms, roughly a 4-to-1 ratio. And the big difference, of course, is all the animal protein that we consume. I mean, when you open the refrigerator, and you see the milk and the meat, and the poultry, the ham, the cheese, ice cream, yogurt, these are all produced with grain. And increasingly with soybean meal as a supplement. But it takes a lot of grain to move up the food chain. China is now the world's leading meat consumer. And in pork consumption per person, China is now well above the United States. In beef and poultry, it still lags quite far behind. But this second source of demand, people moving up the food chain, is becoming a major factor. The third source of demand is the conversion of grain into oil, i.e. ethanol. What we are doing in the United States in an effort to reduce our oil insecurity is to convert grain into fuel for cars, thereby increasing world food insecurity. The grain required to fill a 25-gallon SUV tank with ethanol will feed one person for a year. So the idea that this is the solution to our problem is not a valid one. If we converted our entire grain harvest into fuel for cars, it would cover maybe 18% of our automotive fuel needs. But what has happened now is that with this capacity, substantial capacity, last year we harvested 415 million tons of grain. Of that, 106 million tons went to ethanol distilleries. That's enough to easily feed 300 million people at average world consumption levels. But what's happening is that the food economy and the energy economy, which used to be more or less separate, are now beginning to merge. And given the capacity to convert grain into oil that we now have, the price of grain is therefore tied to the price of oil, because if the fuel value of grain is greater than the food value, the market will move the grain from the food economy into the energy economy. And because of this link, as oil prices go up, grain prices will follow. If oil goes to $100 a barrel, grain will move up. If oil goes to $150 a barrel, grain will follow it up. And I don't think even most economists yet have quite realized that this linkage exists. And if for some reason, civil war in Nigeria or a blow up somewhere in the Middle East, world oil supplies were to contract quickly and prices rise dramatically, grain prices would also go up because it would become much more profitable to convert grain into fuel for cars. So these are the three sources of growing demand: population growth, rising affluence, and the conversion of grain into oil. On the supply side, we also have some new trends beginning to emerge. I'll talk about three of them: falling water tables, melting ice sheets, melting mountain glaciers. Over the last half-century, the world demand for water has tripled. And in recent decades, we have developed a pumping capacity that has no precedent. Up until powerful diesel or electrically driven pumps, we really couldn't deplete aquifers using animal power or human power. Aquifer depletion was not a problem. But when you get enough wells pumping from an aquifer, powered with diesel fuel or electricity, then water tables begin to drop. Today, half the world's people live in countries where water tables are falling. And what we are, in effect, doing is creating food bubbles. If you look at say, a grain production trend in a country like India, where there's extensive overpumping and water tables are falling in almost every state, the overpumping artificially inflates the growth in grain production in the short run. But since overpumping is by definition a short-term phenomenon, at some point, the overpumping comes to a halt and the pumping is necessarily reduced to the rate of recharge of the aquifer. So this is the food bubble. The World Bank reports that 175 million people in India are now being fed with grain produced by overpumping. At the Institute, we estimate that for China, the figure is 130 million. That there are food bubbles in at least 15 countries now. The United States is also extensively overpumped. But for us, only a fifth of our grain harvest comes from irrigated land, so it's not nearly as important as in India, where 3/5 of the grain harvest comes from irrigated land, and in China, where it's 4/5. Saudi Arabia, after the oil export embargo in the 1970s, realized it would be vulnerable to a grain export embargo, a counter embargo. So using their oil drilling technology, the Saudis began looking for water, and they found water about a half-mile down. It's a fossil aquifer, that is, it does not recharge naturally. And they've been pumping that for more than 20 years, and they've been self-sufficient in wheat for more than 20 years. But in 2008, they announced that aquifer was largely depleted, and they're going to phase out wheat production. From 2007 until 2010, their wheat harvest dropped by nearly 70%.